Hey there, Solar Warriors. I'm Nico Johnson, and this is SunCast. Each week, I pull back the veil on the life and business insights of cleantech entrepreneurs building the most noble and impactful companies of our time. I hope what you learn from this conversation is a catalyst for your own growth. So thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our tribe. Hey, Solar Warriors, welcome back to SunCast. Thank you so much for giving us the only non-renewable resource that you possess, and that is your time. We are so grateful that you're here. If it's your first time, I hope you'll listen all the way through, and when you are finished, give us a rating and review, an honest one, especially if you like what you hear in iTunes or wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts. A little thumbs up on Spotify always helps. Matt Harper is a pioneering clean tech entrepreneur and product developer. As Chief Commercial Officer of Invinity Energy, he's transforming the evolution of what we call the grid edge, grid storage and value creation to enable the energy transition that we all desire so much. Matt has been in this industry for a long time, and he's looked at product creation from a number of different angles. We'll explore that and much more in today's show. If you like what you hear, then I would encourage you to check out the more than 375 additional founder stories and startup advice that we have over at mysuncast.com. Don't miss out on twice weekly content just like this, from practical, tactical episodes on Tuesdays to deep dives with entrepreneurs like Matt on Thursdays. And I hope that you will stick around and get all of the juicy goodness out of this episode. For now, we're going to get ready and tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune in to another powerful conversation here on SunCast. All right. So if you have been following the wild and crazy world of energy storage, battery technology, and chemistry, no doubt you've heard of a little company called Avalon Battery. Today, we've got Matt Harper, one of the co-founders of Avalon, that merged with another company in the UK called Redtea, formed Invinity. We're going to hear more about how all of that came about, but there's a whole lot of backstory to this energy pioneer, and that's why, of course, he's here on SunCast. Matt, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. Stoked to be here.
Man, I'm stoked to have you as well. I get a lot of requests from listeners for more information about energy storage. Where are we on the spectrum of deployment? What kind of chemistry and technology should we be looking out for? And I always invariably say, are you familiar with anything beyond lithium ion? And of course, you and I know that most folks are focused on battery storage technology that powers cars and sounds like lithium ion. And there is so much more chemistry, from vanadium that you guys work with to molten salt and, the old standby big pools of water at the top of mountains that we call dams. But you didn't start out your career implicitly figuring out how the vanadium flow battery was going to revolutionize energy storage. Could you give me a sense of your first exposure to what we might now consider clean energy or clean power, and how you decided that this is how you're going to focus 2+ decades of your career?
Sure. Yeah. So look, I got incredibly fortunate. My first summer after my first year of engineering school, I stumbled into an internship with a company called Ballard Power Systems, which was at the time and still is one of the kind of leading lights in the hydrogen fuel cell industry. I spent my summer, pulling a wrench underneath the belly of a fuel cell bus, putting together some of the first fleet prototypes for fuel cell buses, and really have never looked back. I think, I spent some time at Ballard. This is sort of back in the mid 90s. And then after I graduated from college, went and spent some more time in the hydrogen fueling space, some more time on hydrogen fuel cell powered devices before getting into the flow battery world in 2005. I think that if I was to say, there was no single moment when I decided that this is where I wanted to focus. But, as I've thought about it over the years, the thing that I want to do with my career that gets me fired up more than anything else is working with smart people on hard problems that matter. No industry has that kind of people in it to the degree that clean tech or sort of new energy does. And I've been so fortunate to work with incredible teams, incredible people over the last 2.5 decades, and that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, it's an incredible journey that you've had as well. What makes you a product guy? Like how do you differentiate, especially as a founder and co-founder that mix of skills that either differentiates, whether for me, like I'm sales and marketing, you're heavily product focused. What about your background sort of led you down that path of being on the product and the product development side of the business?
I mean, it started off just by having those skills, right? I mean, I my first roles in cleantech were on the design and design engineering side, and that's really sort of what formed my initial sort of opinions and thoughts about what was needed to make commercial offerings in our market work, right? It was the classic sort of if you build it, they will come kind of thing, right? I was fortunate back sort of about 15 years ago after I'd been at my first flow battery company for about 2 years to start to take a look into the commercial side of the business and sort of started to understand that it's not necessarily about have you built the best mousetrap. It's have you done the hard work to make sure that people understand what you're doing, understand the value that you can deliver, and that you're phrasing those opportunities in a way that they care about. It's easy to stand here in 2021 and say, storage is a big deal. But, we spent a lot of time back in 2008, 2009, walking into boardrooms and saying, big batteries are great, and got a lot of blank stares. That ability to sort of, communicate what storage can really do, what those products can really deliver is absolutely critical.
You started out in engineering as well, and then went on to MIT for a master's in engineering. Fundamentally, how have you seen over the last 2 decades the way that engineering is approached, or maybe what observations would you have around how the world of engineering has evolved with regard to product and application engineering in the clean energy space?
There's more people out there who think that and who are proving that, the fundamental technical underpinnings of some of the things that we're doing are absolutely critical to the business models that they intend to deliver. I'm of the view that, a background in engineering is a phenomenal background for running companies in this space, right? Not only because, ultimately we're trying to, deliver technical solutions, but, because of the engineering and especially the engineering design mindset that background teaches you. If I were to think about, some of the tools that I apply to fix problems and resolve challenges in my business, it's I always go back to the engineering design process, right? How do you make sure that you're staying in the problem space until you have all the options on the table? How do you make sure that you're not rushing through ideation and brainstorming? And how do you make sure that you're giving the right context for problems to solutions to emerge? And then prototype, right? And some of the guys I work in my business are tired of me saying, we gotta prototype the process. When they're saying, well, you don't need to prototype inventory management, but I think you do, right? And that sort of design-oriented approach, I think, is really valuable. And I look around in industry, and I see a lot of other people in the space who have been successful with engineering background. You only need to look at guys like Jigar Shah, who trained as an engineer and now is running things that don't seem like they're fundamentally technical things, but having that fundamental background, I think, is really beneficial and has certainly helped me do the things that I've been able to get done.
I look at your career, and there were some brief stops in other industries, right? You worked for Canadian Airlines. You worked for an audio engineering company thinking about consumer products. Did your time, albeit brief, outside of the broader energy infrastructure industry inform how you think about designing products that people will use?
Yeah, it did, especially in that sort of consumer electronics space where there's nothing like trying to put your product not in front of 10 or 15 or 100 people, but in front of 15, 20 or 100,000 people, to understand pretty quickly how people's responses inform how you need to build and deliver your product. So that was definitely valuable. What did I learn from my 8 months in the airlines? That airplanes are the biggest, coolest machines in the world, and that working on them is more paperwork and regulation than I ever wanted to deal with.
So then in, the mid part of the aughts, you got introduced to a company called VRB Power. I'd love to hear how that journey with VRB led to kind of where you're at today. And I'll ask a bunch of questions, I'm sure, about what key decisions you made along the way. Before we get into that, what did you maybe always intend to do as a career path, but never ended up going down that path?
Let me answer the question a little bit differently because I got to an inflection point, midway through my career. I always had this notion going through my undergrad that of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to, run international teams. I wanted to invent stuff, have patents, et cetera, deliver meaningful new product to market. And I kind of woke up one morning in about 2008. So, I've been working for about 8 years or whatever, and I'd kind of made it, right? I kind of done those things. One of the super insightful pieces of information that one of my longtime mentors gave to me, decades ago was school is not the thing that you do when you know what you want to do. It's the thing that you do to figure out what path you want to be on. And so, that was that realization that I'd kind of done everything set out to do was what gave me the impetus to go back and look at going back to school and doing a master's degree. And really, as part of that, as part of that path or as part of that experience, what I realized was, the world of energy, the challenge that was facing us was really bigger than what I had been looking at up until that date, and really saw the possibilities that, as we had more and more renewables, what storage would be able to do for the grid and for the decarbonization path in general. And so, having that broader perspective, I realized that I was in the right place and finished school and, skipped the job offers from, large international consultancies and went straight back into the energy space and have not regretted it one bit.
So tell me what VRB Power Systems was all about and how that product, and ultimately led to Prudent and Prudent to what we know today as the technology that you guys are deploying.
Absolutely. Yeah. So VRB Power was the original licensee of the Vanadium flow technology into North America. The technology had been invented in the late 1980s in Australia. It had been developed through the 1990s in primarily in Australia and Japan. And in 2004, 2005, we saw an opportunity to bring the technology into North America to serve the North American electric grid. We very early on realized that the technology had really been developed, as a very well-funded research program, and one of the outcomes from that is that it was way far off from something that would ever be commercially viable. And so, what we set to do as VRB Power was to take the fundamentals of that technology and really sort of cost reduce and cost optimize some of the core technological components that went into delivering those flow battery solutions. We're reasonably successful in that. We delivered our first couple of projects to the field. We started down the path of trying to standardize some of those components. Like a lot of companies in that space, we were reliant on our investors' funds to keep the company going, and we were looking for another round of financing in 2008. And you can imagine how that went, middle of the financial crisis and whatnot. So we ended up packaging up the core assets of the technology and selling it off to a company called Prudent Energy that was based in Beijing. Prudent had been formed primarily as a materials developer. They were developing some of the core materials for flow batteries, and they saw buying us up and integrating us into their company as a way of getting all the way to the customer, right? The sort of vertical integration story. I think that, we were, the deal closed on, January 24th of 2009. We were on the plane over to Beijing the day after, not really knowing what to expect. And I think we all thought that we'd kind of be doing a kind of 3 to 6 month tech transfer exercise. And then, the guys in Beijing would be off and running with it. 4 years later, we were still running a lot of the core technology development, a lot of the systems engineering out of our base on this side of the water.
Well, let's get a little geeky for those who will value such things, and many of our listeners will. Help me understand the fundamentals of vanadium, why it's a good technology for energy storage, how it works in a battery, what maybe even we should go into defining what flow battery means compared with other types of technology.
The easiest way to describe it is that what a flow battery does is it takes the two fundamental things that a battery does, which is store energy and generate power. And it separates those two things from one another. So you've got big tanks of a liquid electrolyte where the energy is stored. And then you've got an electrochemical conversion device we call a cell stack, which is where the energy in that liquid is converted into the power that is useful outside of the battery. The flow comes in because obviously you've got to get one of those things into the other. And, so we've got inside a flow battery, you're circulating the electrolyte that lives in those tanks through the cell stack to continuously feed that charge and discharge reaction. So you've got those, that's where the flow word comes from. What that allows us to do is a number of different things. I mean, first of all, whenever you separate two elements from one another in a system like that, you gain the ability to discretely manage those two elements, more than you would otherwise. So, for example, controlling the thermal, the heat that's generated in a battery, we can do that very, very effectively because we're separating where the power is generated from where the energy is stored. In terms of the application fit, one of the benefits that separation gives you is you can scale the energy storage and the power generation perfectly to whatever a particular site needs or particular application needs. So you need double the energy storage, you double the size of your tanks. You're not doubling the overall size of the battery system, which is what you'd have to do if you were trying to execute that same step with, for example, a lithium array. When it comes to vanadium flow batteries in particular, the advantage that we have is, and this is, getting that, we're going to like flow battery nerd class, 102.
Completely.
The positive in a vanadium flow battery, in any battery, you've got a positive and a negative electrochemical couple that form that charge and discharge, that reaction. And you're passing electrons from one to the other, and that's fundamentally what the charge and discharge is. In a vanadium flow battery, the positive and negative couple are made of the identical material. They're both vanadium ions that form that positive and negative couple inside the battery. And what that means is that over time, as you charge and discharge the battery, the interactions between those positive and negative couples don't cause any sort of degradation. Right. If you think about the charging and discharging of a conventional battery, you're plating a material onto a dissimilar electrode and then ripping it off again when you discharge and vice versa. That process is always kind of 99.99% complete. But after 1,000 or 2,000 charge and discharge cycles, that 0.001% starts to catch up with you. We don't have any of that degradation mode inside the battery because of the identicality of that positive and negative couple. So what that means is that we have a battery that doesn't degrade as you charge and discharge it. You can do tens of thousands of cycles with vanadium flow battery without, the loss of capacity that, everyone who owns a cell phone has experienced having with a lithium ion cell, where, after 1,000 charge and discharge cycles, you've only got a fraction of what you started off with.
Matt, I want to bring it back up a little bit to maybe 10 or 20,000 feet. That was an amazing explanation at a chemical level of how the technology works. We'll probably get in a little bit more to the iterations with your product in the marketplace and where different types of batteries fit in the overall spectrum of the energy transition. But you mentioned something that I'm intrigued by. Prudent, you guys went to Beijing, sold this technology off. As an observer, my first question is kind of, why isn't Prudent a $100 billion company and why are you now working for someone else?
Sure. Yeah. So look, I think the challenge that we saw, back in sort of 2012, 2013, was that, Prudent was really focusing in on two things. They were focusing in on very, very large utility scale applications, primarily in China. And they were focusing on delivering those projects in the same way that everyone up until then had delivered flow batteries, which was, in the form of a device that looked like a small chemical plant with, huge tanks and pipes and all this kind of stuff. What we saw at the time was an explosion in the amount of solar projects being, installed, especially in the Western U.S. And we were looking at, what that would mean in terms of an opportunity for the technology. Because the problem that we saw is that the grid scale stuff wasn't going to scale as fast as we wanted. It wasn't going to grow as fast as a company like ours needed. And there was so much innovative entrepreneurial work being done in the solar space that we thought that fundamentally was the model that we needed to attach ourselves to if we were going to grow the business. The parallel challenge on that with that commercial side was a technical one. Most flow batteries to date have been installed, on the order of, maybe a year to a year and a half from shovel in the ground to commissioning. Solar projects, even back in 2013, when we were thinking through this, were being delivered in the scale of, megawatts per week. We knew that we were not going to have a product that was fit for purpose for that market unless we thought about things differently. So the sort of the fundamental innovative step that we went through with when we formed Avalon was to say, could we take this technology that we knew worked really well, that we knew had strengths that would be very much fit for purpose for the solar industry, and turn that into something that was a totally turnkey product where we could be delivering it out of a factory, delivering it to site, plug and play, and having those things up and operating and serving the needs of, solar customers, within hours. And that was something that we couldn't do within the existing organization. And that's what led us to believe that we needed to jump out, form Avalon, and go it alone.
You mentioned how, solar was scaling. A lot of folks have looked at storage as a natural complement to solar, and you had experience with that element of the business. But for those who maybe here are either unfamiliar with the business model generally or are more focused on solar as a business, what makes the storage business different from solar, and how did you conceptualize within Avalon sort of baking that into your business case? Obviously, I remember, because I sort of know the history and path, that you tied it closely to solar. But why was that decision made, and how is the business different from solar?
I think that the way the business is fundamentally different is that with batteries, there's a decision point. Right? When you go and install a solar array in a field, you optimize it, you install it, you plug it in, and it operates. When the sun is out, it delivers power. With a battery, you need to be observing the conditions within which that battery is installed and making a decision on a minute-by-minute or second-by-second basis about whether you should be absorbing energy, dispatching energy, or holding. And that step of having that intelligence built into the system that delivers value is a massive difference. Because what it means is that, for example, some of the business models that have led to, huge inflection points in the solar industry are not as applicable for storage, right? The standardization around PPAs and other similar contract structures have been hugely beneficial in the solar space, in my view. That standardized contracting isn't the same in storage, because there always is this fundamental decision-making step that has to happen in order to make those devices really deliver value.
Hey, by now, I'm sure you've probably heard about our mission-minded program, getting your dream job in clean energy in 12 weeks. Our current cohort has given us great feedback and kudos, I might add, as they go through the material and our coaching calls. You can see more about what this program looks like at suncast.vip. That's our brand spanking new webpage to talk about the mission-minded program. That's also where you can send friends, family, neighbors, colleagues that you know who might need a little extra help, a little guidance to find that dream job in clean energy. Our mission-minded program cohort is ongoing right now. We are taking a waiting list for our next cohort. I'd encourage you to do two things. One, send anyone you know that might be interested. Two, those of you who are so inclined, please go check out suncast.vip and email me, nico@mysuncast.com. Matt, I really appreciate you taking some time to help us think through what the business models are. I feel like I could probably do an entire episode, with you on exactly how we are going to harness monetize the coming energy storage, as it were. But at the risk of maybe even a non sequitur, I want to kind of move on to a few other questions. I apologize for any listeners who are angry at me right now that I'm not giving all of the appropriate follow-ups I could, but we have a lot to cover. But thank you for that. I'm sure we'll actually circle back around to some of those ideas as we move forward. One of the core things that attracted me early on to better understanding chemistry and technology within the storage space is the various platforms that exist around storage. And one of the things I know that attracted, for example, Dan Shugar and Nextracker to work with you guys back early days of Avalon to help validate your technology was the notion that you guys state in your vision statement that you want an industry to be economically and ecologically sustainable. How do you think about the negative externalities that exist within the industry of energy storage, in particular with rare earth metals and others? I've had conversations here on the platform about the difference between lithium ion and lithium iron phosphate, and just the sort of those iterations just within the lithium ion family. Flow batteries and vanadium is a completely different mixture, as we've talked about. Can you talk a bit about those negative externalities and how at Avalon you look to harness that as a part of the business proposition?
I mean, first, I'll talk a little bit about sort of the product itself and then some of the underlying elements in it. I'm not going to throw too much mud on this. I mean, I think that there's, the lithium industry, will solve the supply problems. The old story about cobalt coming out of the Congo and whatnot, that's going to get resolved, right? It's just a matter of time. There's so much effort being pushed in that direction that we'll see that happen. From our perspective, I mean, look, the fundamental starting point is that, an asset that you can use over 30 years versus an asset that you can use over 10 is going to have, a lower environmental footprint. If you look at the levelized cost, if you will, the levelized cost of externalities, it's going to be better if you've got a more durable device. And that's where we sort of start off. In terms of the fundamental materials themselves, the vanadium electrolyte that we use in our battery is recyclable forever. I mean, the thing that gives us the battery its durability is because that material doesn't change over time. So, we've taken that material back from, projects that have been in the field for a decade and then put them out into new batteries, right? So it is a fundamentally totally circular, totally reusable material. Once you take that vanadium electrolyte off to, a new battery or back into the steel industry, whatever you want to do with it, what you're left with is a battery that, literally 98% of it could be recycled in your curbside recycling bin. It's polyethylene, polypropylene, steel, aluminum, copper. And so, we can very easily decompose the battery into, things that can be recycled using existing methods, existing techniques. The other question we get asked all the time is about, what the heck is vanadium? And, is it, similarly either A, hard to get, or B, coming from parts of the world where we don't want to buy it? And vanadium is not that at all. I mean, it's the 13th most common metal in the Earth's crust. It's, it's under your feet, it's under my feet. Most of the world's vanadium is used in steel manufacturing. So the production of it today is primarily in countries that are doing a lot of steel production. But, there are producers in North America, in Europe, in Asia, all over the place that can deliver this material. One of the things that I find most exciting is that one of the most abundant sources of vanadium is in a waste material called fly ash, which comes out of heavy oil refining. There are millions of tons of vanadium rich fly ash lying around the world in places like some of the oil fired power plants around the Gulf Coast, or the tar sands up in Alberta. And as we move to be, a much larger part of the global energy industry, I think what's going to happen is that we're going to start targeting those waste streams as the primary source of input into our battery. So even before we build something that can store energy, we're already going to be having a positive environmental impact.
There is a need for, I sense, a diversity of operation. We talk about the difference between lithium and vanadium, their use cases, et cetera. Some might look at, and I think you hinted a bit at this, some might look at the solar industry and say, well, look, kind of one technology, silicon, has dominated the solar space. Won't that happen in storage as well with lithium? Many folks have posited this.
And look, I think that it comes back to that applications point, right? I mean, solar panels, there's not a solar panel in the world where you don't want it to make power when the sun is shining. Right. That's fundamentally the model for those devices is, make hay while the sun shines, as it were. And that is something that is totally different from what you see in the storage space. I mean, there are storage applications where you want to discharge, 1,000 times an hour. And there are storage applications where you want to discharge 10 times a year. What lithium has done is it has showed us that there is a phenomenal business case for storage in general on the electric grid. Right. And where lithium does a phenomenal job is in doing things like peaker plant replacement, where you're looking to fill in, 500 hours a year of the highest peak demand on the electric grid with a device. That's where lithium it does a phenomenal job. But, what we are laser focused on and kind of the North Star for our business is, what happens when you go to longer durations and higher cycles? What happens when you're trying to take, 8 hours of of good solar generation every day and turn it into 14 hours of baseload power that's going to get delivered overnight. That's a battery that needs to do tens of thousands of cycles over its lifetime, and it needs to deliver those cycles for 10 or 14 hours at a time. That's an application where lithium is less well suited, and where we are bang in the middle of what we can do really, really well.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and it's super helpful. I think that, again, there's probably a masterclass on just how the energy grid evolution is going to heavily depend on energy storage, long and short duration, power versus energy, which we have a whole separate Tactical Tuesday on for those who want to look it up, that I did years ago with my buddy Mike when he was running marketing for Vision. I think he did an excellent job actually explaining the difference between power and energy and why that matters for flow batteries versus devices like lithium batteries. I mentioned a couple of times that company. I think it's worth asking the question here, and I hate to press one more time on why does Avalon exist and how has it survived? But I'm going to ask that question almost directly. The energy storage highway, as it were, the evolution of this industry has, is littered with bleached carcasses of companies that I've mentioned and others that have failed to provide the kind of customer acquisition track record that investors and the market look for to validate a technology. Yet Avalon continues to succeed. It is now part of, had the merger with Red T, which we'll talk about, and Invinity is the manifestation of that vision. But what did you do differently? Why did you succeed where others have failed?
I wish I could point to that one thing, and I'd write a great book about it, and everyone would love to read it, and it'd be wonderful. But I can't. I try as I might, I haven't been able to point to one single point. Look, a couple of the critical success factors, or the things that I would point to are, it's a long road, right? You look at the technologies that are currently serving the electric grid, and they are not things that came to be overnight. You're talking years, if not decades, of development to get these devices to the point where they're commercially viable and really making a material difference. In terms of, what we did differently as compared with some of the other things that I've seen in the marketplace, we from day one had a focus on commercial viability, right? I think it's really easy, especially with the amount of, grant funding and sort of other things like that in this space. It's really easy to go down a path of, grabbing onto the dollars that will keep you alive and doing development to get yourself moved down the road. The problem is if you can't pivot from, a supported position to one where the technology can live on its merits and live on its commercial merits, you can end up down a dead end. And, what we did from day one is, even though we took advantage of and continue to take advantage of some of the phenomenal programs that groups like the CEC and DOE have funded, we always made sure that the next project would live on its own merits. And I think that maintaining that commercial focus is something that has borne out well for us, because it meant that we didn't make decisions that ultimately wouldn't have a place in the market. And that I think has been really helpful.
I had Josh Beck, friend of yours and mine, on several times. Most recently, back in February, he and I talked about the importance of strategic partnerships. I'm sure that's a conversation you've had with Josh a number of times on flights to China. But, BCI Ventures was an early investor in Avalon, notably also early investor in Nextracker. Obvious the connection there for you guys in terms of early deal flow. Talk to me a bit about, as a startup, as a product founder, the importance of strategic partnerships in getting the venture beyond the VC fund, the VC round, right? Getting it to commercial viability, like you just said. And how do you look at those strategic partnerships, having been through them at VRB and Prudent and now Avalon Invinity?
Well, look, I think that's it's a perfect extension on the last question. Those partnerships, on the commercial side, on the manufacturing side, even on sort of the material supply side, if you talk about the partnership that we have had with Bushveld Minerals in South Africa, one of the world's biggest vanadium producers, those partnerships are absolutely critical in our space, because the job is too big to do on your own. right? You need other people who can step in and not only provide, acceleration or, add gravitas to your position, but, for example, I think the number one criticism or the number one complaint or the number one rejection that we had when we were out pitching VCs was, we get it. The technology looks good. We think that the market's going to be huge, but we just can't differentiate one battery from another. So we're going to stay on the sidelines. And partnering with a group like Nextracker who could say, look, we've got the technical chops. Our CEO is an engineer. We've got the technical chops to go in and tear this thing apart and figure out what really makes a difference, and then partner with the right companies who can do so. That is, that's a big differentiator. And so to give that, because it lends so much credibility to be able to say to, the investment community, look, the operations guys have looked at us. They know they can build a factory and they're going to put the money in. To go to some of our existing customers and say, look, one of the biggest names in the solar space is standing behind the things that we can do. That credibility is an enormous part of building a business like ours.
So Matt, I think I've got a pretty good understanding of the why and how Avalon came into existence. You just mentioned the partnership with BCI and Nextracker. It seems to me like these early strategic partnerships helped to cement what we call product market fit. What comes next between product market fit to commercializing a product, identifying weaknesses in delivery, fulfillment, that leads you to not just commercial success, but now becoming a publicly traded company? Walk me through that process.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the starting point was a lot of the work that we did with the likes of BCI, right? I mean, understanding that there's a product market fit is great, but if you can't deliver reliably and repeatably and at a reasonable cost that people are willing to pay, you're still not down the right path. So, back in kind of 2017, 2018, we spent a lot of time really sort of flushing our supply chain through, making sure that, we could deliver these things, that were then delivering devices that were reliable, that, met the goals that various customers had, and that we could do that in a way ultimately that was going to be scalable into, higher volume manufacturing. The fundamental point that we always had in the back of our minds, though, is that eventually this becomes a game around scale. We were approached in early 2019 by a company called Bushveld Minerals. I think I mentioned earlier, Bushveld is one of the biggest vanadium producers in the world. They're also the one that's taken the most aggressive stance towards evangelizing and trying to operationalize the vanadium flow battery side of the business as well. They approached us and said, look, we like you guys. We'd like to invest in you. We'd like to become a strategic partner. We'd like to be part of your story. But as part of that, we think that there's an opportunity for you to, massively accelerate your growth. After some no names conversations, they introduced us to the team over in the UK that was running Red T at the time. Red T was in some ways a very similar company to ours, similar technology, both vanadium flow batteries. But they had a different focus in terms of how they were building and delivering product. And what we saw is that there would be a great set of synergies between some of the commercial and call it sort of customer engineering side of their business with the fundamentals of the core product that we had in hand that would, combine together and not only give us sort of a global reach in terms of the commercialization of the technology, but really a full suite of solutions in terms of everything needed to have our customers make money. That would seem like a very compelling argument. I think the other thing that we were seeing, and this is, of course, through the benefit of hindsight, is, in the last year, it's one of the things that's been really interesting in our industry is to see the degree to which public markets have started to pay a lot of attention to clean tech and green stories. That certainly wasn't the case 2.5 years ago when we were first engaging in these discussions. And what we saw was sort of the first glimmers of that interest, which was fascinating. I remember coming back from one of my first first meetings over in the UK, and there's a CEO group here in Vancouver that I engage with a lot, and I was hinting at our plans, and they sort of went, yeah, you got to be crazy. You don't want to be public markets. That's ridiculous. Well, here we are 2.5 years later, and that's where so much of our industry has gone. So it was interesting to kind of like be right on the precipice of that significant change in the industry.
Well, begs the question, is it the right thing for a growing company to go public? We have so many, from SPACs to outright public offerings, different exchanges. How do you know if this is the right thing for a growing company? I think a lot of founders in your shoes are making this decision right now.
Yep. And look, and I think it absolutely is. And the reason for that is because, there is a well-trodden path for development stage companies and companies at the early stage of commercialization to fund themselves through public markets, right? This is an industry that individual investors want to be engaged in. Right. This is an industry where, huge multi-billion-dollar funds are looking at putting a tremendous amount of money towards. And this is the established route by which people can go and do that. Cleantech has always had a bit of a challenge at the sort of later stage development, early stage commercialization world where there hasn't been a good development pathway. And I think that the funding that you can pull in from the public markets are a good way to do that.
That said, I have had this conversation very recently with Anthony Catachanis of Victory Hill. So I'm curious to hear your take on it as well. They also went public on the London Stock Exchange. Why London?
Frankly, it's because, just pure tactics. That's where the company we merged with was already listed. Now, it turns out that this was deemed under the AIM rules to be a reverse takeover, and a reverse takeover has all of the same hoops as an IPO. So we kind of might as well have done it anywhere. But there was the history, and that was a reasonable starting point. Certainly, looking back 2 years, the appetite for ESG centered and green technologies and stocks was a lot riper in London than it is over here in North America. Clearly we've seen that change in the last 12 to 18 months, and change for the better in my view. But that's what sort of had us originally pointed in that direction.
With regard to merging with another company, you've done it before. Obviously, you took your idea from VRB, you went into Prudent. I don't imagine this was similar. They're a decade apart in the transaction cycle. How do you, as a founder, think about merging with another company? What was hard? What was easy? Who helped? Who got in your way? What'd you do right? What would you do differently?
Yeah. We closed our deal in London, closed the merger deal in London, and announced it to the public on March 13th of last year. And, that was 2020. That's right. Yeah. That was the week that all the circuit breakers on the exchanges were tripping. That was the week where, the stock markets had lost 30% of their valuation and, et cetera, et cetera. It was a really bizarre world to try and get that deal done in. And I'm incredibly thankful for some of the advisors we had on hand for our ability to just push through and get it done. What that meant is that, Larry Zalch, our CEO, and I flew home, on the 14th of March and went into lockdown and have literally been integrating with our team, talking with the other executives in the company and making this merger happen, over Zoom for the last 16 months. So it's been an unusual time to do that kind of work. And, I think that I don't know if any of the lessons that I've learned would be applicable to someone trying to do the same thing now. What I will say is that it's been a phenomenal time to do a transatlantic merger. Right. Because, the guys who are, down the road from me are no further away than the guys in Scotland. And, we've adjusted our working hours a little bit, and we have gotten very used to, being on video platforms all the time, like everyone else has. But it's, in terms of integrating the two companies together, it's been really good. It's actually one of the things that we're most concerned about. Is that now, as we're looking forward to going back to the office, how is that going to change? How's that going to change the culture, right? What is it going to mean when all of a sudden, 40% of the people in the company are closer to you because you are actually in the same building as them, as compared with this even playing field that we've had up until now. That's a huge cultural change, and not one that, the rest of society is going to be going through all at the same time, like was the case a year ago when we were all adapting to sort of the virtual environment.
Is there anything about being in the office that will help you more effectively operationalize the ideas that have come out of the last year of being merged with Red Tea and going public?
Yeah, and look, absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge believer in the power of in-person interaction and just the richness of the experience that you get, talking with people in real time and whatnot. One of the essays about sort of how work works and how people work that I sort of come back to over the years was written by a guy named Alan Shepard, who talked about sort of three pillars of how we engage with the world. He talks about autonomy, resonance, and tone. And it's that, in terms of our interactions with other people. And it's that resonance point that is so critical with those in-person interactions. I mean, as much as you and I are having a great conversation now, seeing people in the flesh and exchanging and challenging and pushing their ideas in person, I think is just such a huge part of what makes me make better, smarter decisions. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back to that world.
I love how thoughtful you are and your answers are. And I've been following the work that you guys have been doing for a decade. As a leader of teams, you often have to think about how to be inspiring. And a question I sometimes ask that I want to kind of drop over to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is if you were invited to give a TED Talk from any stage, maybe TEDx London, maybe it's actual TED main stage, what would that talk be about?
I would talk about why storage matters. I'd go back to kind of the basic fundamentals of why what I'm doing, what Infinity is doing, and what some of the other people in our industry make a difference. I think that it's easy in an industry like ours to forget why the industry existed in the first place. And, going back to this notion of we live in a world where we've become very capable of controlling the resources available to us. And the ability to use electricity on demand is one of those things that we've not yet mastered. The ability to take that, all of that renewable energy that is generated at low cost and use it to replace sources of energy that we gain by flipping a switch and burning fuel is a huge and fundamental step that I don't think is really appreciated in sort of the change that it really implies. What I would say in a TED Talk is the inflection point that we're trying to go through from something a source of energy that we do control to a source of energy that we don't control implies opportunities and challenges that we're only at the beginning of understanding. But, again, to sort of, go back to that kind of that North Star for our business and for my work is, looking at how do you make that energy 100% available on demand, 100% dispatchable, available when you need it, and do that with the low cost and the reliability that we've come to enjoy over the last 100 years of this very mature, very well evolved, grid system, which is, look, it's the biggest machine humanity has ever made is the electric grid. We're upending that machine. How do we make sure it's still going to do what we want?
Matt, I'd love to, you've interacted with some of the folks that I consider to be icons in our industry. I imagine you've interacted with even many more that I've never got a chance to meet yet. With regards to solar or perhaps the broader renewable energy, when you think of success story, who comes to mind? So I'm not a believer in kind of the great man theory of, how industrial stuff gets driven forward. I mean, it is impossible to deny, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk their successes. But I think that those are the exceptions rather than the rule. When I think about the people who I have been most energized by engaging with, it's some of the great teams out there. I've walked into meetings with guys like, Generate Capital or, the team out in New York with D.E. Shah and just realized that I'm around a bunch of people who, whose IQ are, 10 points north of mine and are having more fun doing their jobs than I am. So it's just been, great to engage with teams like that. And I think that's played out in the industry as well. I mean, you look at
the core teams from companies like SunEdison and SunPower and where they have ended up, the companies that they've gone on to form, the teams that they've worked with and that they've pulled through to, new and future projects, and the successes that they've had subsequent to those engagements. I think it really is, renewables is a team sport. And I think that would be what I view as kind of the critical aspect of moving some of these companies and some of these initiatives forward.
What are some of the key lessons or takeaways from important mentors or folks that have had key influence in your life or career?
Let me mention three. The first one was I had the guy who was my manager back in VRB Power and Prudent Energy days. I remember having a conversation with him when I was sort of thinking about what my career path would be, and he said, "Look, it's really simple. Do the thing that you are better than anyone else at doing. You're going to have more fun doing it. You're going to be better at it, and you're going to go further doing it." I think I mentioned, the other one was, again, around that same time, one of my mentors said to me, and again, this is when I was thinking about, should I be going back to school? And I was like, but what am I going to do there? And the point he made was, it's not about understanding, what you're trying to learn. It's about understanding what paths might be open. And that was, really, really important to me and really sort of informed my thinking. And the final one was, just before we formed Avalon, or around the time we were forming Avalon, I spent a year working for an electrochemical wastewater treatment company here in Vancouver for a guy named Jonathan Rohn, who always pushed me to understand that you're building a business, and building a business means building commercial opportunities, and that means that everything you do has to have a commercial focus, even if it's not perfect, even if the projects are supported by money that comes from somewhere that doesn't flow from a cash flow. Having that commercial focus fundamentally underpins the scalability of any business, and that commercial focus will carry you a long way.
Yeah, that brings us full circle to the comments you made earlier about being able to find that commercial focus and always not settling, not feeling justified, like, okay, we got this government funding, that's good enough. I have to imagine that there were some darker moments in the growth of the company. I mean, certainly, just as an industry participant, there were times where I was like, I wonder if Avalon will ever make it to the anything that looks like a finish line. With that in mind, how do you as a leader think about, and certainly from a product perspective, where there are constantly ideas thrown at you internally and externally about what you can, could, or should, would do, how do you determine when to stop digging, how and why to keep digging? How do you manage that from a team engagement perspective, project management perspective?
Look, I think it comes back to the point that you just made, that team engagement. I worked for a short time for a company in my history. I'll be a little bit vague, but it was a company where it was a startup where the founder, I think, found the company in some difficult times, really tried to internalize that struggle, really, tried to sort of go inside himself and fix the problems. And it failed catastrophically, right? He ended up with a failed company and a pile of lawsuits on his lap, which was not the outcome any of us wanted. To my comments around sort of, in this industry, it's teams that drive things forward. In dark times, I've been able to sort of go back to my team and say, look, we're in a tough spot, but here's what I know, here's what I don't know, here's what we're doing, here's what we're not going to be able to do. And that sort of, openness and complete transparency, especially when things aren't going well, I think has been critical to keeping my team together over the last 7 years. And there have been rough patches, but we've maintained a high level of cohesion and have made it through the storm.
All the headlines talk about a ton of money flowing into the industry. And I think as we've discussed some of the infrastructure challenges we've overcome, some of the financial challenges we've overcome, how do you, as a leader of a company that is opening new markets, think about addressing the human capital issue, attracting the right talent, and really filling that huge talent gap that we have right now, creating the buoyancy we need, we need hands on the oars.
For sure. And look, it's an area that I'm starting to see a lot more a lot more progress. People from very different industries are starting to wake up and pay attention to the opportunity in front of us and to the opportunity to make real change. When I see guys like Mark Carney, the former chairman of the Bank of England, joining, becoming head of ESG for a $600 billion investment fund. That is, driving green and clean initiatives. I mean, that's a huge change. I think as an industry, we need to be a little bit less us versus them and a little bit more big tent, right? Some of the advocacy work that I've seen over the last 5 or 10 years is very focused on advancing a single point of view. And if we're going to become the dominant force in the industry, we have to broaden that focus and think about, not just how do we make more batteries? How do we install more solar? So how do we make the industry in general, a lot more profitable, a lot more sustainable, and a lot more have a much bigger impact?
Yeah, I want to ask a kind of a quick question. Coming full circle back to the very beginning, Ballard Power, you got started in the fuel cell industry. Hydrogen power was shouted from the mountaintops in 06, 08 from Governor Schwarzenegger himself, and it's seeing a bit of a revival. Ostensibly, in some ways, green hydrogen, stands to compete with the industry that we've tried to stand up with viable energy storage solutions like Invinity solution. What are your thoughts on the current green hydrogen buzz and boom, and where does it sit in the overall ecosystem with energy storage as we've discussed it today?
It's all part of that same landscape, right? Like just in the same way that I talked about sort of the differentiation and the parallel opportunities for both flow and lithium, hydrogen is exactly the same, right? I mean, my personal opinion is that, personal automobiles, lithium ion has won the day. And, there's not going to be any other fuel source for those vehicles, 5 years from now. For heavy duty vehicle fleets, especially where those fleets are in a limited geographic area, hydrogen has some tremendous advantages. And so, look, I think it's going to be the bifurcation of where in specific markets those individual technologies are best suited.
Are there any particular resources that you have found very helpful, maybe that you refer your team to, that others coming along the journey you'd be able to refer them to, in particular around energy storage, kind of trends and things, websites that you commonly go to?
I mean, I'm a big scanner. I look at, everything that comes through on, a lot of the sort of the main industry publications and try and tease out the things that are showing sort of unique and interesting thought. Because
what are those publications that you follow then?
Things like some of the solar media magazines and publications, some of the renewables industry magazines and publications, same kind of thing.
Are there any particular books that have made a big impact on you? I'm a reader. I think I know a lot of our listeners are readers as well. I'd love to hear if there's anything you might recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I would go two directions with that. In terms of I tend to read books for breadth, not for depth. I mean, when I'm looking for depth in my industry and in my area of practice, I look more to, journals and articles and all that sort of thing. I talked earlier about, the degree to which sort of the design process is something that has really sort of informed my thinking and going back to, some of the key books on that. I've read pretty much everything Don Norman has ever written, starting from The Design of Everyday Things was a book he published in the mid-90s that, has long since been dog-eared and tagged and scribbled on in my bookshelf. More recently, there was a great book written by a guy named Frank Chimero called The Shape of Design, which, is I think for a lot of people, design is very nebulous, and it's what he put form to what can be seen as a very nebulous process, which I thought was fascinating. Otherwise, I mean, along the lines of, what I said about, the things that drive me, doing hard things with great people, all of those stories of intense collaboration I find fascinating. Things like, The Right Stuff, the story of the early space program. That's amazing. There's a wonderful book written by a guy named Peter Hopkirk called The Great Game, which talked about sort of the trials and tribulations of some of of the sort of the great forces of the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s struggling for power in Central Asia. I mean, and the stories of the humans who went and did those great campaigns, trying to, push forward. I think, things that, from a 2020 lens are perhaps, not as we view a lot less on sort of those imperial campaigns now that we might have sort of 100 years ago. But, the individual stories of, people who came together to do great and adventurous things, I find super compelling.
I'm sure folks are going to want to reach out to you. Where do you like to be found?
Given that it's, coronavirus, I on my front lawn with a 6-pack of beer, frankly, because it's the only chance I ever get to, interact with you. Yeah, exactly. Look, easiest way to get in touch with me is probably LinkedIn. I am on there pretty frequently. I'm not a huge Twitter user, but it is what it is.
We'll link to that. Do you have does Invinity, or is there a blog or anything like that you all regularly update that you direct people to?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, our website, invinity.com, that's infinity with a V for Vanadium, is where we keep all that stuff. There's blog posts up there. There's all of our news feed, including links to, a lot of the stuff that myself and some of my team are putting out in the world. So that's a good starting point for understanding more about who we are and what we do.
Let's end today with a bold prediction, as we always do. Matt, what one thing are you watching in the market that maybe nobody else is tracking? What's in your crystal ball?
My prediction is that, that this whole decarbonization and race to net zero is going to happen way faster than any of us have predicted. I think that the targets that we thought would be achievable by 2050, we're going to see starting to pick those off, around 2030. That's not a bold prediction. I think a lot of people are saying that. My bold prediction is that when we get to 2030 and have tread that path, what we're going to realize is that everything we needed was already on the table in 2021.
I love that. That is so well put. Well, with that, Matt, thank you so much for joining us here on SunCast. It's such a pleasure to see you, my friend.
Thank you, Nico. Great to chat with you.
All right, Solar Warriors. I hope that you're as inspired and saturated as I am with the goodness of being able to learn from a fellow entrepreneur, someone who as well was an intrapreneur and spent more than 2 decades helping bring to fruition products that are going to impact our daily lives moving forward. If you would like to learn more, then you, my fellow Philomath, can find all the resources we've discussed here, the highlights and book recommendations, along with the social media, the link to Invinity's website, and so much more over on our blog at mysuncast.com. Just click on the show notes and you'll find this episode. Since I know you're already jumping online, I'd love it if you would take a moment, go to LinkedIn, as Matt just encouraged you, and find him, connect with him, but also find the note that we've published on this episode and share it with a friend. That would mean the world to me, and a real treat, I'm sure, for Matt and his team to see that you care enough to tell the world that you thought this was a great episode. I would also encourage you, lastly, to come back again, check the SunCast feed next week, as we always drop another episode on Tuesdays that's practical and tactical in nature, and another long-form episode like this one on Thursdays for you to learn more about how to build your own career as an entrepreneur, intrapreneur, thinker, thought leader, creator, co-founder in the clean energy revolution. Thanks again for listening to SunCast. Thanks once again to our sponsors for helping make it free and possible for you. You can learn more about that at mysuncast.com/sponsor. Remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.